I think a coach could give a player feedback on his behavior and say, hey, pull him aside and you've been dogging it in practice, right? XYZ, you got to step up and lead, right? I'm giving the feedback. And they walk away and go, I held that person accountable. And I don't know if that's the same thing. Accountability, is it dying? Well, I know a lot of coaches out there who would say it is, right? They complain about the state of society, how parents and schools, they don't hold kids accountable. And yet accountability is an essential part of building a team of high trust, of high standards and strong relationships. People need to know that if they fail to meet standards, that they're going to be held accountable. But what does that really mean to hold someone accountable? And does it always have to be negative, right? And does it always have to invite conflict? Now, I know in my book, The Culture System, and I also do this laid out in the TOC Coach Certification Program, we lay out a framework on how to create a culture of accountability, establishing, supporting, and enforcing high standards and strong relationships. To start off with, where you've got to establish those relationships where when we hold people accountable, that they trust and know that it's in their best interest. But we also need to establish, really clear standards that are also connected to the natural consequences of failing to meet those standards. Like, why do we need these standards? Well, the natural consequences is where you start to explore the importance of those standards. And then, as often as possible, before we can hold people accountable and enforce consequences, we have to provide them with support, with effective feedback, with skill and capacity building to be able to meet our high standards. And then when we do enforce, there are so many different ways you can do this that are both positively by reinforcing the right behaviors and also still in a positive way addressing behaviors that are below the standard using things like logical consequences. Now, today's conversation, the podcast, it is actually exploring things beyond the book, beyond what we've potentially even discussed in our coach certification program. We're going to unpack how framing the terminology around consequences can be helpful. We're going to talk about the power of positive accountability, why athletes struggle to hold each other accountable, and how the first level of accountability, like the first step to it, is actually self-accountability as a leader. And lastly, we're going to talk about how does a lack of accountability break down trust within a team environment. Welcome back to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nerbun, and I'm with my friends, Betsy Butterick and Sanderson. The mission of this podcast is to help you grow as a leader and build a better team culture. To get the notes to this and every episode of the podcast, subscribe at tocculture.com. Also join us at TOC Coach, where you can get the best coaching courses and community around leadership, coaching, and culture. Also check out Betsy Butterick's work, her latest book. You can see it at betsybutterick.com. It's her book, Kids These Days. It's absolutely unreal. You can also get it now on Amazon. So be sure to pick up a copy of that one as well. All right, Betsy, let's get this conversation kicked off with this question here, because I know this is something that's come up for you recently. And when you talk to coaches and when you hear coaches out there, when you're on the speaking circuit there and working with teams, what's some things that you see coaches get wrong time and time again when it comes to this word accountability?
What I see frequently, and I would say, JP, this isn't just coaches, this is more broadly people, is everybody agrees it's important for individual and team success. And yet most people, most often, do not have what we would deem a positive experience with accountability. And when I say positive, I don't necessarily mean it feels good, but I mean, is it productive? Does it support the individual? Does it support the team or organizational goals? So what do they get wrong is, I think what's wrong, or what the opportunity is currently, is there is a lot of opportunity for identifying the way that we individually have experienced accountability conversations, either been held accountable or have held someone else accountable. So we have a better understanding of where are we at, because just the word accountability, a lot of people you can see kind of draw back or like, yeah. But also it's not a positive association currently for many athletes, many coaches, many people. And so I think starting with, okay, where am I when it comes to accountability? What do I believe about accountability? And if I want to start to experience accountability different, then what needs to shift or change? Because there is so much that goes into accountability conversations that can shift or change But I think what has to happen first is we need to start to think about accountability in a different way in order to have a different experience and to change the way that many accountability conversations happen.
All right, so that gets me thinking, we're talking a little bit about coaches and you mentioned people in general, Betsy, but I'm curious, what do athletes get wrong, right, around the word accountability? Because honestly, when I ask athletes, what do you need from your coaches to be successful? The two most common things are they want their coaches to support and encourage them, and they want their coaches to hold them accountable. What the heck do they mean, Nate?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, JP, because I get the same thing when we do focus groups with athletes and their requests of coaches. What can coaches do better? It's holding everyone accountable is a phrase that comes up all the time. And when you start to dig into that with an athlete, like what frustrates them about how their coaches handle quote unquote accountability, I think number one, like they just see inconsistency, because maybe upperclassmen there's a perception that they get treated differently than the underclassmen, or the star players get a little bit more slack, or whatever it might be. But like whatever the standards are, whatever the rules are for the team, the athletes would say that it's not consistent, and they have all kinds of stories as to why. I think a second thing that frustrates athletes is a lack of clarity. When a coach gets upset in a practice because a standard is not being held, or let's say for effort, for example, we're just not working hard enough. A player might turn, and I've seen this happen all the time, where they're like, they don't understand what are the exact behaviors here that are demonstrating a lack of effort, because that conversation has never happened. So the player would certainly agree we have to work hard to get better. But what does that exactly look like? What are those behaviors that are above the line, below the line would be language that we would use. Like if you haven't had those conversations, then there's just confusion. And so players don't know how to hold each other accountable because they can't see it when it's happening or not happening, in a practice. And then I think the third thing is that players or athletes would feel like they don't have the skill. Like if you ask them, okay, so what's your role in this whole idea of accountability? Because there is a back and forth here. It is a relationship, and it's a process that you as an athlete and the coach are both cooperating in. What's the athlete role? And they would say, yeah, I got to lead myself, I guess. Okay. And what happens when your teammates aren't meeting a standard? Well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to have that conversation or confront them in a practice, or in a team setting to try to get us above the line. They don't have the skill because they've never been taught. They've never practiced it. And so all of those things lead to all kinds of frustration around just the word and subject of accountability for athletes.
And Nate, that ties directly in what do coaches get wrong? Coaches assume that their athletes know and have the skills for how to hold each other accountable. And because they assume that they have the skills, what I hear often is they're afraid to. Like they make a judgment about fear. Heck yeah, they're afraid because they don't know and they don't feel skillful. And what if it damages the relationship? Like there's just these assumptions made around accountability, what accountability means, what it doesn't mean, what it looks like, doesn't look like, sounds like, doesn't sound like, the impact it will have on a relationship. And so we have all of these assumptions, but we're not being intentional about teaching skills and then repping skills before we put people in situations where things they value are at risk.
This is getting me so excited here. There's so much good stuff here. Like I just backtrack real quick. Nate, you actually clarified something I said earlier, which coaches want us to hold us accountable. It's actually hold everyone accountable, like everyone, double click, highlight everyone, because accountability builds trust. And when they don't feel like accountability is equal there, that's where it's breaking down trust. You guys are talking about skills to be able to hold each other accountable. I'd also say one of the frustrations is that coaches might be holding athletes accountable of things that they lack the support, the capacity, or the skills to sometimes even meet that standard. And what I mean by that is, talking to a coach the other day, I said, if you had a 15% 3-point shooter, do you think you could take that player and make him a 45% 3-point shooter in 1 year? He's like, no way. I was like, but you could probably move the needle with some coaching support. Absolutely, we can make them better. I'd say, well, sometimes you come in, you take a player with a 15% work ethic, and you want to put them at a 75% work ethic. good luck. They don't have this capacity or skills to make that jump. And so we have to be building those things so that they can actually meet the standard. That's hard, right? That's really, really hard for a lot of coaches. And just one other thing, this is what also gets me so excited about my new book, The Culture Captain, hopefully coming out in June here, is athletes constantly saying, I've been doing all these athlete interviews as I've been writing the book, and their struggle with accountability is like, you guys mentioned a few of them, but also, who am I? Who am I? Like, who am I to hold them accountable? And secondly, I'm really uncertain. And coaches say the same thing though. They're like, there's a lot of gray area. Like, I don't really know if they're having, talking bad behind their teammates' back. And like, there's a lot of little things in the gray area, So I think there's a lot of things that make this challenging.
This is where, for me, like when we talk about what is accountability mean? And in every conversation, every room that I've ever facilitated accountability conversations, what we get to is accountability at its core is responsibility. So who are you? You are a person that is responsible for your choices, your actions, your words, your behaviors, and you are a person that collectively is responsible for taking care of the culture of this program. But we take away that responsibility, and then we create this hierarchy of, well, you haven't had enough experience, or you're not so, this age, or whatever. It's like, no, as a person who is part of a group, who works with other people, you have an individual and collective responsibility. So who are you? You're a person that matters in what we're doing, and you have a voice that you can choose to use to support people and standards that we say are important for success.
When someone is trying to hold the team accountable, and they'll roll their eyes and say, who is he to tell us to work hard when yesterday in practice he's dogging it here? So there's an aspect of integrity to all this as well. Like, in order to have any credibility in that role, for your voice to be heard, it takes that leadership of self and self-responsibility to the standard first, or it's going to fall on deaf ears, completely. And that's true for coaches and for players.
Amen on that one. Amen. Right?
Can I throw a wrench in there? If that's true, you can still do it. What's required is that you have to first own what everybody else saw the day before. Hey, yesterday I wasn't giving my best effort. And I know I really let the team down, which is part of why today I feel responsible, not just for upholding our standard, for working hard in practice, but making it known that we're not getting it done.
But another amen on that one. Like, accountability, absolutely. Are you holding yourself accountable? And when people see that, right, then they'll follow that. And that's another one for athletes is like, well, like that who am I? Like, I'm imperfect. Yeah. Okay. We all are. Here's a question for you all. And I think that there's probably these terms here that maybe there's some overlap. Maybe they're distinctly different. Maybe you see them as the same things. And maybe we disagree on how we actually define them. Accountability, discipline, and I'm going to throw a third word in here, feedback. Giving someone feedback, holding someone accountable, and disciplining someone. What's the difference between those three things, if there is, for you all?
And I also feel like there's some wisdom to impart of why you chose those three words specifically.
Well, I don't like going first because I'm the question asker. I think there is something I see in these, but I'm actually really curious your perspective on it, because I think people get these things, they use them kind of interchangeably, or they do these things and they think they've done something else potentially. For instance, I think a coach could give a player feedback on his behavior and say, hey, pull him aside and like, you've been dogging it in practice, right? XYZ, you got to step up and lead, right? I'm giving the feedback, and they walk away and go, I held that person accountable. And I don't know if that's the same thing. And then I don't actually know. Like, I think I would probably, especially when you look at the culture system framework, we talk about enforcing standards. There's a lot of accountability, holding consequences, and then all falls under, for me, transformational discipline. So I would say maybe for me, discipline is more a type of accountability. It's a way to hold, is to step in, is to enforce a consequence. Hopefully that consequence has been agreed upon. And hopefully for sure that standard's been agreed upon, right? So that's maybe the connection I see on those, is the discipline is a form of accountability. Now, what does feedback have to do with accountability? I think feedback can be a part of accountability, but I don't think it even needs to always be there. I think it's really great when we have feedback before we have accountability. So you think about like a severe accountability in a workplace. If you're not meeting standards, and then you come into your end of your performance review, and I, give you a poor review, and now all of a sudden it affects your bonus and affects your job. Maybe now you're on a performance plan, or we're going to be moving you out. It's like, have I given you any feedback? Have we had conversations? So, and even then, when I say give you feedback, I'm misspeaking. Effective feedback's a two-way street. It's where I'm communicating what I'm seeing, you're communicating what you're noticing, and we're talking, and I'm learning about you, you're learning about yourself, and it's a dialogue, right? Effective feedback. So that's kind of a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of how I'm kind of starting to see these things overlapping, but there's distinct differences. But I don't think as coaches or leaders, we always see the difference.
JP, I think if I was playing a word association game with this, when you talk about discipline, I think most kids are going to think consequence, punishment. Like there's definitely something has gone wrong, and now there's going to be punishment because of that thing. And as you said, like that's related to accountability, but accountability is maybe more of a wider, definition there. When I think about accountability as a difference, I think discipline, this is just me, but I think discipline associated with rules, if this, then this. I think accountability more to the standard, which, it isn't like play hard or else. It's like, as we talked about before, if effort is important to us, what does it look like? What are we agreeing to? Why does it matter? There's conversation around the standard. And I would like to say, like, this is part of, I think, the problem in general with this word accountability is that most people do have a negative perception of it, because the only time they have an accountability conversation is when they're getting correction. They're not meeting a standard, or they've done something that's whatever. And accountability can also be positive. Like you can have a one-on-one and say, let's take account to where you're at given our standards. And you know what, JP? I think you're working your ass off. I think that you are doing a great job of meeting the standard. In a sense, that's the same conversation. We're comparing where you're at to the standard that we talked about. And the outcome of that is praise and positivity and encouragement to keep going, right? But we never think about a conversation like that as accountability, but it's the same thing. But everybody associates it with, I'm not meeting a standard, and that therefore it's going to be a negative experience. So I think even broadening what accountability means in terms of what's our current relationship to the standard, it doesn't always have to be negative. And when I think about feedback, I really think of it from an athlete perspective, where it's just like, how am I doing? We're trying to do this thing and a kid comes off and it's like, how am I doing? And so it almost feels like the stakes are so low where it's like, I'm watching, you're performing, and together we're trying to help you to do the thing. But it's not set aside where we're going to have this meeting over here, right? It's not a text message that says, hey, JP, do you have 10 minutes after practice? And your limbic system goes crazy because, that's not going to be to tell me how great I am, right? And so to me, it's sort of like those stages of feedback is, how's it going? Accountability is comparison to standard, positive or negative. And discipline, usually is something has gone awry, and now there's going to be a consequence. And I think that's how athletes think of those words, or some anyway, as well.
And to your point, Nate, and I used to teach a framework of choices, decisions, consequences, CDC. But over the years, I found the same thing. Most people have a negative association with consequences. So I had an exercise to clarify for them that consequences on their own are neither inherently positive or negative, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually I just short-circuited and changed consequences to outcomes. Because for most people, they have a neutral association with the word outcomes. We can do the same thing with these three words. So you're talking about playing a little word association game. If instead of accountability, we use the word responsibility. If instead of the word discipline, we use some version of education. And I love that quote that, like, we misunderstand discipline does not mean to punish. Like, it means to teach, a disciple. And so feedback, what if we change feedback to information? So when we look at these words differently, we can start to experience the conversations around these words differently. The biggest thing that I see as a barrier, and I think what largely contributes to the negative connotation around discipline, feedback, accountability is when the conversations happen. Most people have an accountability conversation after some standard hasn't been met. Most people have a discipline conversation when it's time to enforce consequences or standards. Most people get feedback after something has occurred. So what if we change the timing? Okay, what's your plan when one of those things comes up? How can I support? What's your next step? That's my framework for changing the way that we have accountability conversations, because there is a much higher level of ownership and responsibility, which we know are core components of accountability, when we ask instead of tell.
Yeah, there's something in what you're sharing there, Betsy, that for one, there's probably actually, honestly, it makes me a little bit like uncomfortable. I'm like, do we really need to change, the words here? Is it just more about getting people to understand and agree to what they mean? But absolutely, I like that word outcomes instead of what I would have called natural consequences, which are both could be positive and negative. And I love when we explore, I think a lot of times we maybe set standards, especially when we co-create standards as a team. We talk about, okay, these are the things we need to do, but we need to also tie it back to when we do this, the positive outcomes that will result are this. And when we don't do it, the positive or the negative outcomes will be this, right? And it's just kind of like the natural consequences. I think that's oftentimes, the power of just sometimes maybe accountability conversations where, to Nate's point and your point, like, well, we're sometimes doing it on the positive, and I love positive accountability conversations, which, in a team can be when your players are just absolutely going 110% and you pull them in and they're sweating and they've given every ounce, and you go, how was your effort there on a scale of 1 to 10? Oh, 10 out of 10, coach. And I'm like, absolutely. And how's that feel? How's that feel to give that 10 out of 10? Oh, it's great. Yeah. We're getting better, aren't we? Right? Like, it's just a reinforcement. That's a natural consequence of giving our very best, the feeling of pride, the growth of self-worth, right? So I think, whatever words we use, it's helping athletes to understand. But I think to all of our points here, we just stay with these generalities of we got to hold each other accountable, and we reinforce negative connotations with it, which is so then creates challenges down the road.
And even to that point, JP, like, okay, so, and I hear you, like, I hate that we have to change the language instead of just changing the understanding. But when you change the language and experience things differently, the understanding for the original word can start to shift. And to your point, when you reintroduce the original word in a positive association. So like, this is what happens when we're accountable to our standard of hard work. Like, now they've got a positive association with accountability. So it's almost like, okay, shift to start and then rebuild in a reframed way. And then you can go back forward, because now people understand, like, oh, it's not just negative when we have to have an accountability conversation. Remember that time we were accountable and we kicked ass? Like, yeah, that was cool. Let's do that again.
All right, we will be right back to our conversation in just a moment. But first, I'm going to take a quick second to talk to you about the environment that you're building as a leader. So we talk a lot about on the podcast, the human element, like this idea that to truly impact performance, we have to coach the person, not just the problem. Now, if that resonates with you, I want to invite you to the TOC coach community. This is a space designed specifically for coaches who are tired of the box ticking approach and are ready to create deep systemic change in their teams. The best part, TOC Coach is completely free to join. You'll find a supportive network of coaches who are navigating similar challenges that you are facing. Now, for those of you that are really dedicated, the ones who have a truly transformational mindset and want to go deeper, I'd love for you to consider upgrading to premium. As a premium member, you'll get complete access to all 12 of our specialized courses to help you master every pillar of performance, coaching, culture, and leadership. It will also give you entry to all our live trainings where we unpack these concepts in real time. You'll also get personalized consulting for your specific team, so we can help you apply these strategies directly to your context, to your unique environment, because everyone's context is different. Now, whether you're in the free community or premium member, our goal is going to be to help you feel capable and confident and convicted and the incredible work that you're doing. So head on over to tocculture.com to join TOC Coach today. Where does consequences fit into this? We've mentioned some consequences here. I'm a big consequences guy, probably too much, especially as a parent, right? But what I do see, and we talked about this before we started recording, which is if I could have a really good conversation with Nate about him showing up late to practice. We pull aside, hey, I told him, I know you're capable of better. We expect more from you next time. What happened? We getting curious. He talks about it. We put some things in place to help him be on time next time, more so. But then he leaves from that conversation and everybody else is going, well, what's the consequence? What's the consequence? And I think that, the consequences, obviously, like you said, Betsy, can have a very negative connotation. But when we don't have certain consequences in there, trust breaks down,
I think if we're going to talk about consequences, we have to talk about expectations. So even for an athlete that wasn't part of that conversation, what is their expectation about a consequence from that conversation? Are they expecting that if a coach talks with an athlete and holds them accountable, that the coach will also tell the rest of the team, hey, I had this conversation with so-and-so? Are they expecting that a consequence will involve not participating in practice or games for a certain amount of time? What are the expectations around consequences? Because we say well, where's the consequence? But what do we mean by that? What are we expecting to see as a consequence? Because sometimes the consequences are invisible. The consequence of you making choices that are below the line in terms of our team culture is the next time it happens, you no longer get to be part of this culture. So nothing's happening right now, but you are on notice from our conversation. And the consequence might be you don't get to do this thing anymore. So I think anytime we talk about consequences, we have to talk about expectations.
I think, JP, one of the tools that's been useful for a lot of coaches that we reference quite a bit in TOC Coach is the case studies, and giving teams an opportunity to talk about a make-believe example of when a player is late or a player talks behind a teammate's back or, something like that, where the team has a chance, again, before there are stakes to talk about their expectations that come with that, just like what Betsy's talking about there, because it is tricky. There are times in a disciplined situation when there's something that, the coach and the player are going to work through, and the coach wants to protect for whatever reason, the confidentiality of something that a player may have done, and it may not be appropriate to just air it out in front of the team, or your administration may say, this is something that, needs to stay handled in this particular way, and so getting through those murky areas, one, I think you're right. It really requires trust. And that usually comes from a coach demonstrating, fairness and a sense of justice in the past when things have gone sideways or accountability and consequences come into play. But you don't always have the luxury of transparency in a specific situation, but you can introduce in a more general and vague way some conversation where the coach can also articulate, here's how we would see it from this side of the table. Here's what would be important to us. Here's how we would think about accountability or a consequence, but again, in a make-believe sort of case study way, rather than, well, JP did this and here's how we're handling it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about the local boys' school in our town here. It's all boys' school and secondary. And I heard this story the other day about the first day of school. They were sending kids home for having the wrong color shoes on, right? You got to wear black shoes, you got to have a tie, and you got to be all they're using consequences to almost set expectations from day one. But the people say, hey, they don't mess around. They don't mess around. They're setting expectations, not just do you need to have black shoes, but if you don't wear the right shoe, we won't tolerate it. And I think sometimes we try to approach that. I think about a team. It's day one. If you're late, I'm locking that door and nobody's coming in, right? I'm going to hold you accountable. Definitely did that. And I don't know. Is it ever effective to do that? I'm curious, to use consequences as a way to like, we communicated it. It might have been in the fine print in a 20-page welcome back to school manual, but we communicated it and we held you accountable.
I think this is one of those yes and. It's like, yes, because if you didn't read it and the consequence is the door's locked and you don't get to practice today, like you learned something. So are we disciplining, in the way that we teach you a lesson? Absolutely. But then also I think about the consequence, like, okay, let's say half the team didn't read it. You've got a practice plan. Now you can't do half that practice plan because you don't have enough players. So thinking about consequences from not just, how is the individual impacted, but how is the group impacted? And what's the most valuable thing to teach at this time? And then also, for me, it kind of toes the line of like upholding standards through fear or upholding standards through shared respect, responsibility, understanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can I offer something on that real
it can
quick?
be effective. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something interesting. It sets a culture. And by having like very clear boundaries in this.
Mm-hmm.
And when people talk about, let's go back to this all boys school. When people talk about the culture there, it's like a all business. We're going to keep these boys in line. And honestly, some parents and even boys that would have gone to that school would say, hey, that's what I needed. That's what I need. I think about like almost like military type school. I think about one of my, really I'm a big fan of Wes Moore. He's Maryland governor right now, right? And been a huge fan of him for probably back in 2008 when I read the book, The Other Wes Moore. It's just that he wrote about him. And it's an amazing story of his upbringing. But he talked about how impactful that military school setting was for him and it was the thing that was going to be to fix him. And he had been in other schools and there'd been like, so it makes me just think, and I'm just offering this up. I'm not sure, but my thing is like, that could work for some people. They need that structure. They need that discipline. They need really clear boundaries with consequences. And I tend to think sometimes those people that need that are often people that lack a lot of boundaries and structure in their home life. And that we actually provide safety for them because it's absolutely clear without question. And there's not a lot of gray. I could be wrong with that, but that's my theory.
And the word that comes to mind for me, JP, when you describe that kind of a system is it's really, to me, it's more deterrence. Like I think about if your rule is you're going to be on time for the bus leaves at 4:00, you're there at 4:01, the bus will not be there and you will not play, even if you can find your way to the game. That only has to happen one time, because that story is going to get spread like wildfire from year to year to year. Remember back when JP was late for the bus, coach left him, and it's not going to happen again. Right. So part of it is like, it's this idea of, we're deterring that behavior because the immediate consequence is significant enough that it will deter people from crossing that line in the future. I don't think you can do that with everything. I don't think you want to do that with everything, but maybe there is something to be said about, sort of setting a tone or a foundation for culture that in some aspects, we aren't screwing around, with certain things here, the things that are most important to us, whatever our non-negotiables might mean or automatic penalties. But at the same time, does that leave room for grace? Does that leave room for growth? Does that leave room for support? I don't know. But
and I think, when I was listening to you talk about the school, JP, what I was hearing that I've also seen to be true in every team culture with individuals is people want clarity. People benefit from clarity because then they get to make informed choices.
Yeah, I think you really brought me back to maybe one of the principles that often has guided me around consequences versus punishment. And punishment is about compliance. And if you're really good at it, you can get, it is largely fear-based. You can get results. It can be effective. And sometimes I think this clear boundaries and structures can be really beneficial for some people, maybe some young men in particular. And consequences for me it emphasizes choice. You can make good choices, you get positive consequences. You make bad choices, you get negative consequences. But also here, when you make these choices, when we do these types of things, these are some of the types of consequences what we're going to have in our team, in our culture here, because they're there to remind us of the standard. They're there to offer that little bit of that deterrent in some ways. But are we having the conversation when we enforce that consequence that helps to build the skills, to build the character? What I've seen in sports oftentimes is a culture, a team has a lot of compliance because they use the carrot, they may even use the stick a lot, but then they get off, they leave that team, and now the players, oftentimes young men, leave these football teams that I've seen and observed, and now they don't have the skills. And in one school I worked at, I mean, you'd get 10 players on a scholarship to play high school or college football, and 7 of them would be dropped out by the end of the first year. Wouldn't even make it to the first year because they didn't build the skills to be able to have the self-discipline, to have the self-responsibility. I think that's just a huge, huge bit of it.
There's a story I want to share. This is one of the coolest stories that I've heard recently from a coach. And I give this coach a lot of credit for the culture that they've created. And the story they told me the other day was they had an athlete. The athletes have recently come back from break and they did their mandatory drug testing. And the athlete got the test results probably 10 minutes before it was sent to the coaching staff. And the athlete called the head coach and said, "Coach, I want to let you know I just got my results and I tested positive for marijuana. And I want to tell you that that was from a choice I made on New Year's Eve and that this is not something that you need to worry about in the future. It was a poor choice in the moment and I take responsibility for that. You don't need to worry about it happening again. That said, I'm ready to accept any consequences that you feel are appropriate, given the fact that we have a zero tolerance policy." And this is the first time it's happened with that kid. That kid took full accountability. And what the coach told me is the coach was like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, thank you. The consequence is that, should it happen again, there will be zero tolerance. And it just made it such a positive experience for that kid to do what they did. And the coach joked, like, the consequence is you need to teach everyone in the program to do this. So if we'd had that zero tolerance of like, I get the result, you're off the team, it's like, then we've missed out on incredible leadership from a peer, taking responsibility, accountability, like modeling what that looks like and how it builds so much trust versus if I found out that information and then I'm calling the athlete and then they're defending or making excuses. It's like, no, we just dramatically increased the quality of the relationship because of the choice that person made. So when you talk about choices in terms of like, what this looks like, creating guidelines that allow people to make choices and experience positive consequences, make choices, experience negative consequences. That's really what we're teaching in terms of quality culture. So,
that's incredible. It's inspiring. So let's just kind of do a closing thought by each of us to get out of here. Just kind of maybe our biggest takeaway, what's resonating, and I'll kick it off because that story really brought me to, I think, a place where I feel like I've learned something from this conversation, which is I want to develop players. I want to develop my children to be people that take responsibility and actually are not afraid, maybe even sometimes crave accountability from others. They want to be in a team where people are going to hold each other to high standards, push each other, support each other, and meet those standards. And when they screw up, which we will all do, we take responsibility for that screw up. And I think about just the whole thing you get with kids when they grow up is when you lie, the worst thing you do is just to just start adding line and line on top of it. It's like the sooner we can get to just taking responsibility, the more proud we'll be of how they've handled that. So that's my big takeaway.
My big takeaway, similar vein, JP, is I would love to live a life, whether as a parent, as a spouse, as an educator, where I am modeling accountability in such a way that people start to understand or see it as positive. Like that if I can be an example through my own life of accountability that enables people to start to understand that they too could get excited about accountability because of the positive outcomes or consequences that it can generate, that would be great.
Yeah, JP, I think for me, it really comes back to where I started in looking at the frustrations from athletes and just the confusion oftentimes around the standards and behaviors and the expectations. And I just think of myself, if I would have taken more time and been more deliberate, or the seasons in which we were taking time to be deliberate, to co-create standards, to talk about what those look like, to identify when they happen, when they don't happen, and really to embrace this process of who we're trying to become, then it sort of becomes part of our way of life, rather than now we have to start holding people accountable to a thing. It's just a process that we've embraced from the beginning, but we all sort of figured out together where we're started, where we want to go, and what we're willing to do, whether that's be held accountable, or face consequences or receive feedback in order to try to become, or embrace that identity as a group. And I think if you don't do that, the seasons when I haven't done that, then everything becomes confrontational and everything becomes so much more difficult because we didn't do the work in the beginning to agree on where we are and where we want to go and how we want to get there.
Mm. I almost forgot, right? Love this conversation, but we've got our Ask Us Anything to get us out the door here. So we had a coach submit a question here, which I think is so timely for this conversation. And so each of you will give one way. The coach asked, what ways could you build mutual trust with your players? In what ways could you build mutual trust with your players? So let's give them one practical way, maybe. Obviously, we've talked a lot about accountability and building trust through that. For me, the mutual expectations conversation is a beautiful way to do that. Hey, what do you need from me to be successful this season? And okay, then sharing back, here's what I need from you. And then will you please make sure to hold me accountable to what I agreed to on your end? And I'll hold you accountable to what we agreed to there. I think it's just a beautiful way to bring in the fact that we're both players can actually hold us to account as well too, openly, when we make statements that we're going to do something.
This is a really good question. A uncomfortable, maybe unpopular answer that I would have for building trust is, can we go there, meaning do the hard things with people early and invite them into those spaces early for the purpose of teaching them that those spaces are safe with us. So if we're going to build trust with someone, can I have a conversation that many people say, well, I can't have that conversation. We're not there yet, right? It's like, no, can I have this hard conversation with such kindness, compassion, curiosity, to the point that despite it being difficult and the relationship not yet being well established, that they understand I am someone they can trust. And can I invite them to have those conversations with me, to your point, JP, of when you don't see this from me, please make that known. And this is what you can expect to see or hear from me in those moments, because this is really important for how I want to show up for you.
Gosh, that's so good. Yours is better than mine, I think. Oh, unreal. Nate, how
it's
about
not
you?
about better.
Yeah,
I trust that Nate has a good one as well.
I think what comes to mind for me, and this is really fresh because of our work at New Ventures West and going through this executive coaching process, where there's so much emphasis on our early conversations, and similar to what Betsy said, but not necessarily doing the hard thing, but just creating this place of psychological safety and being a really curious listener to understand the world and the environment and the context, both internally and externally, of the person that we are trying to support and help. And I think back to, when I've been criticized for a lack of trust with an athlete, it usually comes back to they didn't feel like they were heard or seen or listened to. And that's on me, right? For not being able to establish that in the relationship, and probably early on. So I think the more curious and the more, we can become better listeners and ask good questions and really just try to understand our athletes, where they're coming from, how they see the game, how they see themselves. I think that is a pretty strong foundation for trust that hopefully will follow.
I'm going to throw a bonus one out there, JP, really quick, which is, if nothing else, this requires nothing of the other person. If you want to establish a more trusting relationship, throw out something that you don't have to throw out there that might address a concern they could have in the future. So an example, if I'm meeting with a potential client for the first time, we don't know yet if we're working together. One thing I'll often say near the end of the conversation is, I also want to let you know, if in any session or at any time you bring something that is a need for you, and I know that I'm not the most qualified person to help you or support you, you can trust that I will be the first to make that known. And I'll probably say, you know what, given what you've shared, I'm probably not the best person for the support that you're looking for, but let me help find you someone who is. But I will always make that known.
I like that. How many coaches do that in the recruiting process, the college level? Hey, just so you know, if at any point I realize that, we may not be the right program for you. I'll
like if I heard that, I'd be like, oh, no, I want to prove to you that I'm right for you. Like, yeah.
Love that. That's great. Love the conversation. Thanks everybody that's listening.
Yeah, thanks.
And please submit more, ask us anything questions. We're enjoying those. So, all right, that's it for today's discussion. If you want to build a culture of trust, you've got to establish relationships and standards, and you got to support individuals to meet those standards, to build the capacity and skills, and you must also enforce the standard. Accountability is key. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with some other coaches out there that might find it valuable, and check out TOC Coach, the online community, coaching, and courses that will help take your leadership and your coaching and your culture to the next level.